The movie is based on an experiment conducted by an American psychologist. He selected volunteers to play the roles of guards and prisoners and set up a real prison environment in one building. People quickly adapted and, to the psychologist's astonishment, began to behave unpredictably. The movie begins with a typewritten advertisement in the newspaper. Its essence is that Stanford University is in need of students and young men for a psychological experiment and the subsequent conditions of life in a prison. After the text is typed up, it is sent for printing. In the next scene, interviews are conducted with the applicants. 3 organizers ask candidates questions, making notes in a journal. Most of the questions relate to their psychological state. Do they have problems with communication, outbursts of anger, a tendency to depression or suicide? It is also clarified whether the students use alcohol or drugs. At the same time, what primarily attracts everyone is the financial compensation of $15 for each day of the experiment. Interestingly, everyone chooses the role of a prisoner rather than a guard. There's less hassle that way. Besides, nobody likes prison guards. However, personal preferences in role selection are of little concern to the organizer. With the flip of a coin, the psychology of the dual-faced characters from the DC universe determines their roles. Participants are informed that they have been assigned the roles of either guards or prisoners, not by choice, but based on non-typical qualities demonstrated during the interviews. The experiment begins in the summer of 1971. An empty building at the university is transformed into a prison-like environment. Participants are given uniforms and warned that the staff is watching, so no physical violence is allowed. To enhance the authenticity of being a prisoner, including Daniel, they are allegedly arrested near their homes and then blindfolded before being brought to a mock Stanford prison. 3 uncertain guards instruct him to undress completely for decontamination. They are provided with baggy gray robes, have chains attached to their ankles, and are led to their cells. All the while, psychologists and a hired consultant who has experienced real incarceration watch with interest through surveillance cameras. 2 more inmates are placed in the same cell as 86-12. On the first day, they chat unhappily, even though it is prohibited by the rules. However, the guards can't do anything about it since they are not allowed to touch them. One of the inmates notices that it's easier to obey, and it's time for the assembly. Prisoners are taken out of their cells and lined up in the corridor. A guard reads the rules while one of the psychologists prepares to present himself to the experiment participants as the prison director. Dr. Zimbardo, the chief organizer, asks him to act as a guard and to treat the prisoners more leniently. However, the consultant advises against it. After the assembly, the first shift of guards is replaced by the next trio. During lunch, one of the inmates asks a guard to smoke, which doesn't sit well with another guard, Christopher, who is referred to as John Wayne. He takes away the cigarette since, according to the rules, smoking is a privilege. Furthermore, prisoners are prohibited from talking, and he emphasizes this with a sharp hit of a baton on the table. Discussing this moment in their cell, Daniel and Peter come to the conclusion that the guards have become too immersed in their roles. Their cellmate Jeff, known as 137, reminds them that they are just playing their roles. It's just a job, even if the prisoners don't like it. Nevertheless, Daniel suggests making the guards sweat a bit. The next day, the director allows the prisoners to write letters home. However, he ignores the requests of the participants, such as the need for vitamins for their eyesight. Among the letters checked by the organizers, one prankster promises to unite the prisoners to disrupt the system. Another submits a request to exit the experiment only 10 hours after it began. The guards conduct roll call, issuing reprimands for every delay and making them start over each time, gradually complicating the task. When they are made to sing songs, the prisoners laugh, prompting the supervisor to come up with new punishments. This pleases the organizers. The subject who took control of the situation from the beginning by clearly defining roles, but the procedure irritates Daniel. When asked directly, he replies that he didn't like the roll call, leading to his placement in solitary confinement, a small and isolated space. The punishment continues later when 86-02 is released from solitary confinement. He must make his bed perfectly so that the other inmates can go to sleep. Wayne's antics escalate the situation, but the observers watch with interest as events unfold. During the shift change, Wayne tells the new trio of guards about his antics. This piques their interest and makes them want to taunt the prisoners as well. The new shift immediately starts tormenting the inmates, forcing them to do physical exercises. Peter finishes the exercise before everyone else, but the guard adds an additional 20 reps. Otherwise, the others will have to do push-ups until he obeys. 869 calls the guards fascist pigs, for which he is sent to solitary confinement. Daniel is once again forced to remake his bed, which infuriates him and leads to a fight. The guard is outnumbered, but the numerical advantage is on the side of the inmates. The observing psychologists, despite the rule violation and the fight, do not intervene. Daniel is sent to solitary confinement, where he convinces 812 to join the block, with the total number of prisoners now exceeding that of the guards. On the second day, during lunch, the guards lock one of the inmates in solitary confinement because he demands the return of his glasses. Although physical violence doesn't occur this time, the psychologists report it to Dr. Zimbardo. However, he also decides to leave the situation in the hands of the guards, despite a warning from one of his assistants. After this incident, the prisoners are moved to different cells, but Peter, who has been released from solitary confinement, incites the others to rebel. They remove their ID numbers and barricade themselves in a cell. Unable to handle the situation, the guards run to complain to the director, but he continues the experiment, telling them to handle it themselves, thus encouraging the escalation of the conflict. Additionally, he hints that the guards can call for reinforcements to tip the numerical balance. Such is the purity of the experiment. The organizer's indulgence leads the second group of guards to forcibly enter a cell one by one, where they use brute force to take away the mattresses and pillows from the prisoners, tying up those who resist. For the inmates in the third cell who willingly gave up their mattresses, the guards organize dinner while the rest of the prisoners go hungry. At night, Daniel plans an escape by removing the bolts holding the lock. Together with his cellmate, they make their way through the institute's corridors when one of the guards notices them. He raises the alarm, but the escapees are not caught by a guard, but by a psychologist who, with his non-intervention, takes the side of the guards. They taunt the escapees, strip them, tie them up, and put them in solitary confinement. The next shift, led by John Wayne, uses a fire extinguisher to deter Peter and his comrades who have barricaded themselves in the cell. Afterward, they break down the door. Wayne lectures the prisoners and promises to return their bedding and other privileges, claiming he's not as harsh as the daytime guards. Daniel, in solitary confinement, shouts that he needs to see a doctor, but the guards ignore him. However, the management, sensing potential health issues, examines him in a separate room. Even during the examination, nobody breaks character. The consultant, who has experience as an inmate, states that Daniel doesn't need special attention, and he is returned to the others. Despite all this time, none of the 8 inmates turned on Wayne, and no one restrained the guard. Daniel has a nervous breakdown. He yells at the observer in the cell that he wants out, but the other inmates do not support him. On the third day, they inform Dr. Zimbardo that Daniel has been released, which he doesn't like. He accuses his colleagues of ruining the experiment. The counter-argument is that the psychologist acted according to the protocol. Another candidate takes his place. However, the organizers come across recordings of conversations in which one of the escapees says that they made a deal with Daniel. If one of them manages to escape, he will come back for the others. The prisoners have a meeting with their families. During the conversation, they do not admit to being mistreated because the guards walk around the tables and the experiment organizers stand nearby. After the meeting, the doctor orders doubling the security. He worries that Daniel might try to stage an escape for the others at night. However, the former inmate doesn't appear. On the 4th day of the experiment, the inmates realize that he won't help them. 8119 informs the guards that he needs to see a doctor, but they continue to ignore him. All the inmates have a meeting with a pastor, but no one understands the purpose of it. Peter is the last to talk. He says he needs to see a doctor, but Dr. Zimbardo intervenes. If he doesn't feel better after dinner, they will call a doctor. In the meantime, the guards have turned the other inmates against Peter, who had created a mess in the cell by tearing apart a pillow. They chant the phrase, "Prisoner 8Y9 did a bad thing." This leads to a nervous breakdown for Peter. Dr. Zimbardo, concerned about the experiment, allows him to leave. On the 5th day, Dr. Zimbardo's fiancée, his former student Christina Maslach, joins them. She takes the place of one of the observers who had to leave due to family circumstances. At the same time, a newcomer is introduced to the inmates. He refuses to eat the prison food, which leads to a conflict with the guards. They put him in solitary confinement with a tray until he finishes his meal, and they won't release him. The organizers hold a parole hearing. During the questioning of an inmate who wants to be released earlier, Christina notices not only that the subject is intimidated, but also that the observers distort information and don't hesitate to use insults for the sake of the experiment. Finally, in her ignorance of what was happening, the fact that the prisoner would refuse the money promised for participation in exchange for immediate freedom convinces her. Of course, psychology has no plans to release anyone voluntarily, even though some participants in the experiment are on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Meanwhile, consultants share information, stating that he behaved during the interview exactly the same way as they did with him. However, the fact that he is a real criminal while they were discussing student volunteers makes him reconsider his stance. He decides to leave the Observer Commission for moral reasons. Thus, the ex-convict found a conscience through trial and error, a rare element in short supply among the organizers. Zimbardo tries to persuade him to stay, but he sets a condition: to release the prisoner on the brink of a breakdown. The next shift, led by John Wayne, finds the eager newcomer in solitary confinement. He tells them that the organizers and guards do not consider the prisoners as humans, which violates the rules of the experiment. Shortly after, Christina becomes a witness to the prisoners being led down the corridor with paper bags on their heads, which leads to a confrontation with the doctor. Dr. Zimbardo says that all participants are volunteers and can leave at any moment. However, the Observer Commission provides a vivid example of how they tried but failed to get the participants to quit. The girl accuses the organizer of blatant lies and data manipulation, which is not far from the truth. After the argument, Zimbardo observes the guards tormenting the prisoners, making them swear, do push-ups, and simulate sexual acts. Driven by a sudden realization, the troubled psychologist enters the prison and announces the end of the experiment right in the midst of the guards' abuse. The prisoners do not immediately realize that they are free. Meanwhile, the guards are interested in payment issues, whether it is for the entire period or only for the actual days. At the end of the film, there is an information note stating that the Stanford prison experiment had to be terminated prematurely on August 20th, 1971, just 6 days after it started. This was due to the fact that the guards began to display sadistic tendencies, and the prisoners could not withstand the psychological pressure and abuse. The participants gather around a table, some of them avoiding eye contact with each other. Former subjects give interviews about what happened. The essence boils down to the official position: placing people in certain conditions, dividing them into uniforms and power structures, and human compassion will leave them. However, none of the participants were mentally unscathed by the end of the experiment.